Hello, hello. I'm Tammy Fisher. I'm the head of legal at Open. Open's a decentralized options and derivatives platform working on power perpetuals and a lot of other really interesting, innovative stuff. But I'm actually not here to talk about Open today. I'm going to talk a little bit more about my experiences essentially being a crypto lawyer, a DAO lawyer. And what that kind of means is what I've seen in the past couple years as far as regulation in the space and how it's developing and how we can have a huge impact on the direction of regulation over DeFi. So I'm also going to tell a little story, a bit of an allegory. Some of my finance nerds might know about this story, maybe some of the legal people in the crowd as well. But it's an older story than MIM or anything like that. It has to do with a onion speculator and an onion farmer. His name was Vincent Kasuga. So Vincent was a pretty poor version of a futures trader, but he traded wheat. Wasn't doing too well at it, so he decided, along with partners in his industry, to corner the onion market. What does that mean by cornering the onion market? He bought 9 million pounds of onions and secretly stored them in off-site warehouses throughout the United States. He owned 98% of the onion market in 1955. What did he do with that? He said, I'm going to contact all of the main onion manufacturers and I'm going to say, hey, guess what? I own you. And I own the price of onions. And not only that, I'm going to short the onions futures market because I control it. So when he did that, he made $8.5 million in 1956, which is the equivalent of about like $70 million today. Basically, you could say like a very, very successful ICO, but in this way it was onions. But as you can imagine, manufacturers, consumers, and of course farmers in the onions business were not very happy about this. And this turned into a huge reaction in the federal government. Basically, what came out of this whole onion crisis, there were congressional hearings on the subject. The president of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, that's actually the same exchange that now does the Bitcoin commodity. If you know anything about that, they've been around for a really long time. They were involved in this conversation. But this bill basically got pushed through by Gerald Ford that said, no more onion futures, period. Not just can't sell onions, sometimes in certain amounts, just no more onions. So I would consider this a overreaction to a problem that could have been addressed through more sophisticated means. So why does this matter? Especially when I'm talking about crypto. I know we have like a lot of meme coins, onions, but basically what ended up happening by outlawing futures for onions, period, was that the effect was the opposite of what most people would expect. The volatility in the onion market was actually still very high, and onions were just more expensive in general compared to other vegetables. So, public outcry equals overly blunt laws. The main problem with when we have public outcry over an overly blunt law is, especially in a complex industry like finance, is you just get nothing in the place where there could be some sort of innovation in effect in the laws, and basically building off of that innovation. I'll go back to the slide. So what did E.B. Harris say? He said, this law is burning down the barn to find a suspected rat. Why did he say that? He's saying, futures are very complex. We can create best practices. There's public education around how futures contracts work. If we actually educate the public and Congress, maybe we could have thought of like a more smart, sophisticated law that actually addressed these issues. And one thing to think about here as like a long-term note was that basically the futures industry in general from this point forward kept kind of fumbling and running into more problems. So not until 1981, 35 years later, did the National Futures Association come about. The cool thing about the National Futures Association was that it's a private sector regulation. So instead of having the government say, hey, this is how you should do things, they're saying, we decide how we should do things and we're going to self-regulate. So great thing about that is it's much more cost efficient to regulate, and it also creates a more smoother operation amongst ourselves. We don't always have to say, hey, governor, hey, state legislator, we want to do this way. we can innovate amongst ourselves. So, sounds weird, but I mean, maybe we can see some parallels for what's going on in DeFi in the crypto space here. Current regulatory climate in digital assets is very, very, very reactive. The first thing I would say is, I'm not sure if you've heard about the FATF, but the FATF is like an overarching international body that has basically said how they're going to regulate AML guidelines for crypto. And currently, this is like a huge, big discussion going on amongst all states. That's the United States, EU, all throughout the world. And basically, it's saying, are DAOs considered VASPs? Basically, what are the crypto registration requirements for projects or developers? That's happening right now. We also have the CFTC chair saying, hey, DeFi options. I don't know what they are exactly, but seems like since they're not registered, they're probably not legal. That's great, right? Like, no clue what it is, but probably not legal because they're not registered with the CFTC. Senate infrastructure bill just passed. There's some blunt language in there that kind of could have been more sophisticatedly written. And then we also have, famous SEC chair comments about crypto and issues with lending and finance. So that's stressful. What should we do about it? It may feel like there's not much to do except like yell on Twitter about why everything about, the SEC, the United States government sucks. But instead of, thinking in those terms, why not think about what you can do as builders in your project to actually push forward best practices? I deal with this stuff every day, and I learned so much from the developers that I work with. Main things. When I say best practices, I know it's like a fancy legal term, I guess, maybe, but basically it's like you set of guidelines, ethics, or ideas that represent the most efficient, prudent course of action for a business or industry. I feel like developers do this constantly with open sourcing their software. It's like, how do we make our software more efficient? How do we improve upon designs to create better mechanisms or security breaches? So areas to think about this in. Security, are you doing audits? Peer reviews, how are you managing PRs? Whitelisting, what tokens are you whitelisting? Are they Doge coins or are they tokens with actual liquidity? Can those tokens be manipulated on secondary markets? Aside from that, the other thing I would say is anything about multi-sigs. I'm not sure what your practices are with your multi-sigs, but definitely something to think about. Maybe you're doing a buyback for your token, huge area for regulation, and to consider how you structure that information. And the last but not least is, of course, anti-money laundering issues. This is like one of these very sensitive topics that it has to be discussed because if we don't discuss it, the regulations will be decided for us. So basically, go to different forums and you'll find discussions about AML laws and DeFi. So maybe you're not interested in being proactively involved in like an organization or something like that. But like I said, if you're building, you have valuable information to share. I always think first, if you have a lawyer or anything, check with your lawyer and say, should I keep this information private? Is this like maybe subject to some sort of trade secret? Is there liability issues if I share this information? Okay, if not, I would share it, but try to be thoughtful about it. I love a good Twitter thread, I know everyone does, but Gitbook, publications, other meaningful mediums of discourse that are a little bit more hefty and better for like the old guard, also very, very good to establish best practices. And if you want to get more involved on these topics, currently, I would say the Blockchain Association, DeFi Defense Fund, and LexDAO are like kind of where it's at. But still so much to be done. I could see a DAO with projects basically forming around the topic. And if you are a project that works in the space and wants to start creating that narrative, I think maybe even creating a DAO where everyone votes and like brings people in through an association would be a very strong method. And yeah, so that's it. If you have any questions or thoughts or anything about like maybe how to build best practices, reach out to me.
Yes. Would you like to do some Q&A now?
Sure. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, just raise